Hello, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. So you're our only one, so I'm going to go ahead and get started.
Okay.
All right. So today we're here to talk about a little bit about the DAT, OAT. Which test are you focused on?
I'm taking the OAT, and I had scheduled a appointment with you a couple weeks ago, and we had talked over the phone, so I've been coming to your workshops.
Gotcha. So this is just an introduction to the test as a whole, looking at the
Mhm.
content of the test and all that. So since there is nobody here for the other test, I'm still going to talk about it because I'm putting this on a recording that I'm going to post later on.
Okay.
Just FYI. Okay. So, welcome to the introduction to the DAT and the OAT. We're here just to talk a little bit about what these two tests entail, how they're similar, how they're different, and you can feel free to ask questions along the way in the chat box. So, let's go ahead and get started. First thing we'll be talking about is how to register for both these tests. And I want to emphasize the fact that this is a registration for the test, not an actual application, because a lot of these tests will say you apply to do this, you apply to do that. Really, it's just like putting your information in and hitting return. So you're just registering for it. It's not like you're applying and they can deny you or anything like that. So for the DAT, what you would do is apply for what is called a DENT pin, which is basically your identification number to get into their system. Then you can register for your DAT as a separate step in there. Right now, the DAT costs $475. It's one of the more expensive of the standardized tests that you might have to take. But it is necessary for many of the dental schools that you want to go to. Once you do that, you should apply for accommodations. And this is a true application. They may not actually give you accommodations. If you had accommodations in high school, I would suggest that you look for and obtain your individual education plan, also known as an IEP. And that would be really good documentation for getting accommodations. If you didn't have accommodations in high school and you just got them awarded in college, it is very likely you'll have to visit with an educational psychologist for a full evaluation for learning disabilities and or test alteration effects, so such as double time, time and a half, test reader, etc. Give yourself 2 to 3 months before you sign up for a test to be able to do that. Because if you sign up and you don't have those accommodations, you may not get the accommodations when you register at the Prometric site. So the other thing is you have to, once you get the DAT signed up for with the ADA, you also then have to sign up for a DAT slot at a Prometric test site. And those prometric test sites are scattered throughout the Bay Area and all over the country as well. There are no particular dates that you are limited to except for the dates on which the testing center is open and available for testing. This is very similar for the OAT, which is actually clocks in at a $490 test. So it is also a very expensive test. You got to realize why these two tests are actually more expensive than many of the others, and that's because most people don't end up taking them because they're taking other things like GRE or MCAT or whatever. These are very rarefied tests as far as the test prep world is concerned. But the same things apply when you're dealing with registering for the OAT. You get your PIN number, you apply to take the OAT, you apply for accommodations, giving yourself 2 to 3 months to be able to get that before you end up registering for your Prometric test. And again, you can register for a test with Prometric at any time that they're open and available for testing. If they're closed for COVID reasons, you are not able to take a test. They are not doing either the DAT nor the OAT as an online from home administration. As far as retaking is concerned, you can retake the DAT with 90 days in between every attempt. You can do it a total of 3 times unless they give you special permission. And that's within 1 year. Then after that, you can take it one more time every year. And then they still do put limitations on that. So don't plan on taking the test more than 3 times. In fact, really, you just want to plan on taking the test 1 time instead of trying to retake. So 1 and done is a good plan there. The OAT, basically the same rules. Now, you might be asking the question, why is the DAT and the OAT exactly the same? Well, it's almost exactly the same as far as content's concerned. We're going to see in just a second where they differ in content. But as far as the rest of the test is concerned, they're both managed and developed by the American Dental Association. Yes, I didn't stutter there. The OAT is written by the American Dental Association. They just share a lot of the burden because, again, since these tests are not taken by very many people, it's a lot of burden to develop a standardized test. So they just duplicate the effort. They're not duplicating the effort, they're streamlining the effort in that way. So what do each of the tests look like? So here's the snapshot of the DAT. You start with a tutorial that's optional. I don't think you actually need the tutorial because you should have taken some practice tests before you go in to take your real test. And so what I do suggest during the tutorial time is that you use that time to get yourself settled. Put your scratch board or scratch paper in the right place. Arrange your monitor and keyboard and mouse so that it's comfortable. Adjust your chair so that it's comfortable. Take some deep breaths and relax a little bit. So those are all things you can do during that optional tutorial time just to get yourself settled and in the mode. The first section, which is in common with the OAT, is the Survey of Natural Sciences. It's 100 questions in 90 minutes. You have 40 bio, 30 GChem, 30 OChem. And really, the annoying part about the section is it doesn't tell you move on to GChem now, move on to OChem now. It's all about pacing. You get an individual score for each of these 3 subject areas. So if you get your score and it's high for bio, high for GChem, but really low for OChem because you didn't give yourself enough time for OChem, that's going to be a worse score than doing pretty good on bio, pretty good on GChem, pretty good on OChem, because all 3 of the scores count and they get averaged together. So pacing is crucial in this portion of the test. You really should be going faster on the 40 bio questions than on the GChem and the OChem, mostly because the bio questions, number 1, are generally more point and shoot type questions. There's not a lot of figuring to do. GChem gets more figure heavy, and OChem, some of the questions there are organic synthesis questions and can take a good long time. The variation between the tests is next, where in the DAT you take the perceptual ability test, which is 90 questions in 60 minutes, which seems like an insane amount of questions. You only have about 2/3 of a second, 40 seconds to answer every question. But that's okay. Most of these questions are literally point and shoot. They're counting cubes and what sides are painted. They are discriminating the size of different angles relative to one another. They are which object is going to fit through the keyhole and various other perceptual ability questions. Swap that out and you have what's on the OAT, which is physics. And the physics test is 40 questions in 50 minutes, which means you have 1.25 minutes to answer every question. The physics is college level physics, algebra based. There's no need for calc based physics here. So you have a little bit longer in every question because you have some calculations you need to be doing, but you don't get a calculator to do them. You have to do them by hand. In fact, for both the GChem and the physics, you generally are setting up math. You're probably not actually calculating it out in the questions. Then you have an optional break in both tests, 30 minutes. Take the break, have a snack, something high in protein, high in complex carbs, low in simple carbs, low in fats, something that'll keep your energy up so you don't get that post-snack crash that a lot of people get. Go to the bathroom, relax, stare at the wall, go blank. Both tests then commence after the break with 50 questions in 60 minutes, but really think about it as 3 passages in 60 minutes. You have 20 minutes of passage to do for reading comprehension. With reading comprehension, there's not a lot of need to deep read these things. Most of the questions, except for 1 or 2 on every passage, aren't asking you to analyze much. They're more about asking you what was present in the passage. And it's roughly chronological. So the first question is probably going to have an answer from the beginning of the passage. The last question will probably have something from the end of the passage. So it's actually not as bad as it may seem. It's definitely, if you compare it to, say, the MCAT, a much simpler reading comprehension test. Finally, you get the quantitative reasoning test, i.e. the math test. And the math test is, you do get a calculator. which is why you actually can do 40 questions in 45 minutes, which gets you get a little bit more than a minute per question, but not much. This is up through high school algebra and geometry, and you'll have questions about things like probability, combinations, permutations, and other sorts of questions like that. I think the thing that throws people the most is they'll be introduced to two brand new types of questions you probably never seen before, which are called quantitative comparisons and data sufficiency questions. So you need to make sure that whatever you're prepping with has examples of both quant comps and data sufficiency questions so that you're well prepared for them. Then there's a survey at the end of both tests, and you can do it. You don't have to because it's optional. I always suggest give them some feedback just so they know how to improve the testing experience for the next day. Overall, the DAT takes about a little over 5 hours. The OAT takes about exactly 5 hours, just because they don't have the perceptual ability test. But in general, they're basically the same test. They only differ in structure by the presence of physics or perceptual ability. How are these tests scored? The scores are actually pretty different. So DAT scores on a scale of 1 to 30, with the median being around 15. This is a scale, it's not curved. So you're not compared against people that took the test that day. So don't worry, you're not being compared to anybody else taking the test when you take it or even near around the time you take it. It's a predetermined scale, which determines what your number of correct questions, how it gets turned into this range, the scaled score range, and how that gets turned into a percentile. There's no guessing penalty on either test. You should just feel free, if you don't know an answer, pick an answer. You might get lucky and get some points there. There are unscored experimental questions. They just don't tell you which ones they are, so they generally won't. You just shouldn't even consider trying to guess which ones they are. Just treat every question like it's real. Now, on the DAT, what score should we probably shoot for? Here's the matriculant data, applicant and matriculant data from 2018 that comes from ADSAS, which is the application service for getting into dental school. On average, people applied, the people that applied put in 10 points, or about 10 applications each, and their average DAT was 19.5. You can only score like 19 or 20, so this is clearly a numerical average. And when you look at matriculants, about a little over 50% get in that apply to med school. These are the ones that I'm starting, and they had a 20.5. So a nice solid DAT to score to shoot for is going to be a 20 or a 21. That will make you competitive for getting into dental school. So a 20 or a 21. You don't need to max out the score. In fact, getting much into the mid 20s is actually a very difficult task. You have to be really on your game, getting less than 90 or like less than 10% of the questions wrong to really start getting into that range. The OAT is scored in the same way, in the sense that it's a scaled test. There's no guessing penalties. There's unscored experimental questions. However, the scoring range is different. It ranges from 200 to 400 in 10-point increments. Why do this? Well, it's that way because if somebody's looking at these scores, they can tell, oh, that's an OAT score, that's not a DAT score. So if you notice, all the major standardized tests have slightly different scoring ranges. It's really to help distinguish them from one another. So when looking at the OptomCast data, about every person that applies to optometry school, on average, they put in 5 applications. About 75% of the people that go to optometry school or that apply to optometry school get accepted. And for their average OAT, we're looking at a 320, a 321, but really a 320. That's what you really want to be shooting for an OAT, is getting 320. The composite is 314.9. It's significantly lower because the composite takes into account the reading comp, and people tend to do worse at the reading comp. So 20 or 21 for DAT, 320 for your OAT. Those are good, solid target scores. So what is covered on the 2 tests? So DAT and OAT share the biology in common. Some of the things I want to point out here is some of the more unusual topics. For example, this test does currently include photosynthesis. You do need to be aware of Calvin cycle and the photosynthetic cycle. So you got to know your light reactions, dark reactions, etc. The taxa, knowing your major taxa and their names, and being able to name different critters. So, or they don't make you name it per se, but they might say which scientific name matches this particular animal, like a worm or a echinoderm or a crab or something like that. So be prepared for those types of questions. That's something that you probably don't remember a whole lot about since you took general bio. The last thing I want to point out as being sort of unusual here is that they also will ask questions about natural selection, about how natural selection works, and about ecosystems. So more of those general biology topics, things that you probably wouldn't consider being important to dental or optometry school, but they are in fact in there. They don't ask a lot of questions, but all in, you might see 4 or 5 questions out of 40 that are on these types of topics. So will you have to do a little bit of dusting off of stuff that you probably learned in high school or college? Yeah, totally. The GChem setup is pretty predictable. It's all of what you would expect in GChem. And again, this is both tests. The place where I find students lack the most ability is when you're dealing with nuclear reactions. So nuclear reactions tends to be something that a lot of teachers leave out when they're teaching the GChem series because they like run out of time at the end of a quarter or something like that. The other thing is the lab, basic techniques and equipment and things like questions like this that might show up. An example is a question could say, what is the best way to accurately measure 10 milliliters of a standard solution? And they would give you answers like use a beaker, use a Erlenmeyer flask, use a graduated cylinder, use a volumetric pipette, use a volumetric flask. And in that case, a volumetric pipette would be most appropriate because we're trying to accurately measure a standard at a single volume. So knowing what the glassware does and how it can be used is important. And this is something that, again, you may not have gotten because I don't know if you even use some of that stuff in your lab experience. Most labs these days use a lot of plastic. And so they use these plastic pipettes and plastic things that don't share names in common with the glassware. So you'll probably have to do a little bit of dusting off of that info. Organic is as expected. They do have straight up synthesis reactions. Individual reactions, major functional groups, and combination reactions to synthesize compounds. So yes, you must be able to do retrosynthetic questions, i.e. pick out the reagents or the compounds needed to produce a final result, or that would be produced from stringing things together from an initial reaction, or sorry, initial reactant. These questions come at the end of the section, which is a problem because when they're at the end of the section, if you didn't reserve enough time for you to do them, these are going to be the ones that take you the most time. So this is why time management is very, very important. So you can get to these last 5 or so questions. Sometimes it's up to 10 questions that involve synthesis and mechanisms at the end of the OChem section, at the end of the natural sciences section. Then we shift a little bit. The DAT has their perceptual ability test, which has those 6 types of questions. Apertures, can it fit through the hole? View recognition, if you see it from the top and the side, what's it going to look like from the front? Angle discrimination, which angle is the right size? Paper folding, where they'll do a series of folds, punch a hole in it, and you'll have to say how many holes and where they'll be. Cube counting, a stack of cubes, paint, how many sides are painted. And 3D form development, where they'll take a flattened out object with a lot of creases in it, and you have to figure out what it folds into, what shape and where the particular markings are. So lots of practice required here because these questions are very, they're not anything that you can read about and understand. There's no one strategy really. This is a lot of working on your ability to visualize things in 3D space. Honestly, a good prep for this is playing a 3D video game. It's weird that I'm saying play video games to get better at something on a standardized test, but anything you do that works on your spatial acuity, that is going to be a useful thing to getting better at the perceptual ability test. And then physics for the OAT, again, this is pretty standard. The things that many students have a little bit of difficulty in is the electrostatics and the circuits, because those are things that in class generally people tend to have issues with. So I would encourage you to definitely focus on those topics plus any others that you feel uncomfortable with. I will say that Physics 7 didn't, if you took Physics 7 at Davis, you didn't generally get all of the equations that you need to know for this test, because the OAT is very equation based and Physics 7 tends to focus more on conceptual equations, not specific equations. So you'll probably need to get like an Anki deck or something with to start memorizing back a lot of these equations, or if they weren't there in the first place, learning them in the first place. So incorporating them into your data banks. And then finally, the reading comprehension, not finally, but reading comprehension. Like I said, this is mostly go back and find the information. There's no science things you need to know for this section, but it's often science subjects in this section. So everything you need to know is on the page. You do not need to know about the topics that they're writing about to be able to answer the questions. Now, finally, quant, you do get a calculator for this. It's an on-screen calculator, and it is basically just plus, minus, times, divide. You can't do powers, you can't do square roots, you can't do logs, you can't do natural logs, you can't do anything fancy with it. So you've got to be looking for other ways to do things. Like if you're going to do large division problems, you probably want to consider doing prime factorization instead of just long division. So this includes algebra, a little bit of geometry, not a lot, data analysis, interpretation, sufficiency, which is those data sufficiency questions, and quantitative comparison questions, which are unique styles of questions that you'll see on these two tests and actually on the GMAT and the GRE. So they've pulled, for the DAT and the OAT, it's kind of this hybrid between what content's on the MCAT and the types of questions that are on the GRE. It's kind of weird. What prereqs do you need? So for DAT, here's what I suggest you have. Now, all of these classes would probably be considered prereqs for getting into dental school, but the ones that you probably want to have before you take your DAT are going to be definitely general bio, GChem, OChem, stats. It's probably a good idea to have genetics, micro, and physio, but you can leave off biochem and anatomy because they are not tested at that great of a depth on the DAT. If you have them, wonderful, but if not, you can save those for your senior year and still be okay, assuming you're taking your test between your junior and senior year. The OAT is very similar, just add in physics to this. Physics is required for the OAT before you take it. And again, genetics, micro, and physio, they'll help you a lot with the OAT. And then biochem and anatomy, you probably don't need to take it before the OAT. You can take it after. So what kind of resources are available out there? What do you see about these two lists? Are they very different or very similar? They're actually very similar. Because the tests are so similar, most of the content that's created for the OAT is actually just DAT content with an OAT label put over the front. So DAT Destroyer is probably the leading DAT prep resource out there. There's other things out there like Chad's videos I know are popular, or going DAT Bootcamp or Crack DAT. But DAT Destroyer's like been around the longest. It's the one most people trust the most. DAT Destroyer also works for OAT as long as you get their OAT supplement, which basically is a physics book that goes with it. There's an equivalent to DAT Bootcamp and Crack DAT, and that is OAT Bootcamp and Crack OAT. Go figure, the same companies that do the prep for one test will do the prep for the other. Princeton Review has an official DAT prep course. They do not have an official OAT prep course. And I want to also let you know that currently the Princeton Review's Cracking the DAT book is not a good choice because it still has not had the math section updated to include the quant comp and the data sufficiency problems. So Right now, I'm afraid I would say like Print and Review I would put them on a second tier right now. Kaplan for both, if you're going to do a prep class, is probably the better way to go. They have a more built out curriculum, and it's modern. So Chad's videos, like I said, are for DAT. There are no physics Chad's videos. You'd have to supplement those. You could probably use something like the Khan Academy videos for the MCAT to supplement the with the physics. And then there is official content. It's available on ada.org/DAT or OAT respectively. But honestly, the official content isn't super useful because it amounts to one full practice test, which costs you, I think, $100 to purchase. You can take it once and you can't look at it after you've taken it. So all you get is a score report. So it has very limited usage. It'll just tell you what your score was when you did it. You can't go back and review it. So it's very expensive for not a lot of benefit. So I would suggest you don't use those practice tests and go with something like Boot Camp or Crack. And they have lots and lots of practice tests that you can go back and review if you're going to go that self-prep route. Or if you use Kaplan or Print Review, if you want to use Print Review or some other company, use their practice tests because the official ones really don't amount to a hill of beans. What does a prep timeline look like for DAT and OAT? Well, first thing I would suggest you do is take a mock test. And we do a mock test every quarter. And so the mock test that we're going to be doing this quarter, I think, is in another 2 weeks. So I feel free to do that. The unfortunate part is there's not a lot of available practice DAT. So every quarter we do the same mock DAT and same mock OAT. We use the Kaplan test. So if you've already done it once, I wouldn't do it again with us. But it's a good start to figure out just where you're at. Am I going to do well? Am I going to do poorly? How much do I need to study? Do I need to study for 3 months or do I need to study for 6 months? Do I need to have a test prep class or can I self-study? So that first test is probably the most important one to help you make decisions. And I know that a lot of folks, they're hesitant to take a test cold because you're like, well, I haven't studied for it, so I'm going to do bad. Well, that's actually kind of the point. We want to see where you're at now so we can figure out how far you have to go to get there, and we can set up scaffolding in between. So you can figure out, okay, got to do this and this and this and this and this. And now you have a plan and you're more likely to achieve that plan. So that's why I always want people taking practice tests. And notice I say do at least 5 full-length practice tests. So like periodically you should be taking practice tests during your studying to make sure you're making progress. A lot of that is geared around confidence building, because if you just study, and then you take your first practice test after 2 months, your score may not go up. It may stay the same, or it could even go down from the cold test you did. That doesn't mean you didn't learn anything. That just means you didn't learn it the way the DAT or the OAT presents it. So you probably want to spend some time testing that as you go, and you'll feel like, oh, I made this incremental change. All right, I made a change, and I made another change, and I made another change. Incremental changes will increase your confidence. And one of the biggest battles on any standardized test is a confidence game. If you're losing confidence, then you're not going to do as well. If you're feeling confident, you'll do better than you probably would have otherwise performed. Rotate through subjects. Don't try to do the same one subject until it's done. If you're doing content review, try to do like bio is Mondays and GChem OChem is Tuesdays and physics is Wednesdays, and or in the case of the other, math is Wednesday, and just pick the content to be rotating, because the rotating will help you deal with the fact that you're going to have to do all of them at the same time anyway. It'll also make it so that you're retaining that information longer, because you don't do bio 3 months before the test and then do all the chem 1 month more before the test. Clearly, you're probably going to do better on the chem than the bio, because the bio is now very, very old. As you're doing content recovery, content review, do practice questions along with it. Not like the end of chapter questions, but like do a 10, 20 questions every time you study. Because like I said, the information is important, but if you don't recognize what you're supposed to be answering or what you're supposed to be thinking about when you look at a question, you're not going to do as well. So you've got to learn the content and then apply it in context. So content and practice are part of the the two sides of the same coin in essence. If you do a good solid job studying, you don't have to spend 8 hours, 10 hours a day studying for this thing. You really could just put in 4 hours a day for like 3-ish months and be ready for a DAT or an OAT if you're doing effective studying. And effective studying is focusing on practice. In fact, focusing on active type studying. So reading a book or watching a video is not active. Active studying is doing something like taking the notes you took from a book and turning it into a lesson plan for a class you're going to teach on that subject. Like if you can turn it into a lesson plan and teach it to somebody else, you understand it well enough to recall it later on. So tasks like that are things that are going to get you better at it. In fact, working with a study group in which you each take a topic and then parse it out like that and get it to whiteboard readiness and teach it to each other, that is a massively useful way to improve your content retention, not just your ability to understand the content, but how long you're going to retain it. Because if you can teach it, you're going to remember it. So practice questions and content every day, do at least 5 tests, spend about 3 months doing it, rotating the subjects. Then when you get to your real test, you're going to be most prepared to walk in and do it. Now let's spend a moment about test prep versus self prep. If you take a practice test and you just do terrible, like you're down at like 15th or 10th percentile, that probably means you've got either substantial content holes, or you have really bad test anxiety or test strategy, like very poor test strategy, or it could be both. Those are the scenarios where I suggest a test prep course. Because they can help you, the teacher will help deal with the content hole and give you strategies as you go. And you don't have to self-teach yourself that. It can be very difficult to self-teach yourself that. It's hard to recognize it in ourselves. But if you're scoring, 40th, 30th percentile, you're not too far from the score you want, then you could probably self-prep. Meaning the self-prep world means you just get the materials on your own, you buy the practice test, you buy practice problems, and then you take the test when you're ready. And I emphasize that, when you're ready. Don't take the test before you're ready. There's no reason. If your practice tests are scoring substantially lower than your target score, and you're not making any forward progress, there's no momentum, you're probably not going to get the score you want magically on test day. If you're showing forward momentum and it's not quite there yet, that's okay, because the momentum means your next test is probably going to be even better than that. So there's self-prepping is really, it's all about like watching your progress and making sure you're making sufficient progress. So that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the floor for questions. While you're typing any questions you have, I'll remind you that we are doing a DAT OAT prep series that's occurring this fall quarter 2020. Our next session is next week, October 27th, and on organic chemistry, we're going to review some practice problems, review some of the content that's on there. Then our mock test is November 17th. You should be able to sign up for it, I believe, by noon this Friday. The sign up form will open. You can find all of this stuff at hpa.ucdavis.edu/testprep. That's where I keep all the links and whatnot. Recordings are going to be on YouTube. They're just not there just yet. And then, of course, if you need to meet with me just individually, we have advising office hours. I have advising office hours Monday through Friday, 9 to 12. And I do drop-ins for study or test prep only, drop-in study hall for test prep only on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 2 to 5 p.m. So please don't make appointments there looking for interview help. So any questions from the audience here? If you have questions, do remember, if you're using your mic is faster than typing. Seems no questions from one. Or the other. All right. Well, then, thank you guys for coming today. I appreciate it. And I think I've seen both of you guys in the test prep sessions on Tuesdays. So I look forward to seeing both of you guys there.
Thank you.